Hello and welcome to another episode of In Search of Black Power. I am one of your co-hosts, Dr. Rasheem, social scientist, independent scholar, and I'm joined here with.
Lawrence Grandpre, Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggles. Good to be here with you as always, Rasheem.
I love talking to you on and off screen. I'm also really excited about this topic today. We're going to talk about race work. I'm really excited because I feel like there's so many ways in which LBS does and talk about and promote race work, and I really want to get into the nitty gritty of like what that is and what that looks like. To help our guests get started, I'm just going to let you know, give you an overview, if you will, of like what this podcast is going to explore. So today we're going to explore the concepts and historical legacies of race work, the long-standing tradition of Black people helping Black people through culturally grounded, community-centered practice. And all of these practices are designed specifically for racial uplift. This episode is also going to highlight how this works predates and in some ways contrasts with mainstream social work. So listen out for that. And that has also, social work has also often marginalized or erased the contributions of Black, Indigenous people of color. And we'll explore a bit of that. The podcast is also going to examine internal debates that tend to come up sometimes within Black communities on an ideological standpoint, whether integrationist ideology or liberatory approaches to race work. And also we're going to talk about a bit about how the fear of white backlash often shapes what strategies different race workers adopt. So before we can talk about it, let's say a little bit more about what is race work. Race work is a deeply rooted tradition, again, in Black people helping Black people. Race work in social work refers to the intentional efforts to address issues of race, racism, racial equity within the profession and within communities that some race workers or cultural workers or even some social workers serve. A person might ask, why is this important? It's important because to talk about it, to highlight it, and to elevate it. We really wanted to have this conversation because so often race work pioneers have played such a pivotal role in social justice, community development, and advocacy. And while there is an emerging body of literature that explores their stories and accomplishments, there's not enough attention given to the strategies, the actual practice. What were the tactics? What were the tools? What were the techniques that we can even use today and help us moving forward?
Yeah, so for the folks out there, this is an introduction to some of the racework ideas, and Rasheem is going to go further in depth on these ideas in a seminar series. And so please stay tuned for more details on that towards the end. But I just wanted to make sure at the beginning we mentioned this is an introduction and there's more in-depth information in the seminar series that Rasheem is doing. But I wanted to talk briefly about some of that distinction between race work and social work from the perspective of some of the things that we've talked about in previous podcasts here on In Search of Black Power and give you some examples along those lines. So I perceive this work through the lens of the work of Martin and Martin. So it's Joanna Elmer Martin to Black African-centered scholars from Baltimore teaching at Morgan State. They are some of the founders of the Great Blacks in Wax Museum, which is a well-known museum in Baltimore that has wax figures of famous Black folks. And I think their writings really encourage us to look at how Black institutions took care of our needs when no one else would. So really a sort of self-determined Black ethic of care that contrasts in many ways from Eurocentric notions of providing basic needs and things like that. We can talk more about that. But I just wanted to give some examples. So maroon societies. Many people didn't believe we could have maroon societies here on the East Coast. They thought they were for Jamaica, Brazil. And an example of the ingenuity of care produced by race workers in the maroon societies of Southern Virginia, Northern North Carolina, like the Great Dismal Swamp, is, they actually have these plants that grow in the marshes called cattails. They have like this long reed and like this brown cone. And the inside of the cattail, that's like this cotton-like substance that's actually very edible. not very palatable, but very edible. And they actually discovered that that was like the central caloric crop that allowed for these surprisingly large communities of Black folks to survive away from the violence of slavery in Virginia through these maroon societies. So that's just one example. Similarly, Jessica Gordon Nemhart in her book Collective Courage talks about collective savings and trust institutions produced by Black folks in similar times. Now, I think, Rasheem, you had some other examples you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are great, fantastic examples. And I appreciate you highlighting and elevating Dr. Martin and Martin's work, spirituality and the Black helping tradition. I will say my first notion of race work definitely came from reading that book. Um, and one of the things that I wanted to do, and I feel like the course does, is kind of build on that legacy of having a deeper understanding of what race work and the many examples. Like I love the Maroon Society example. Some other examples of Black people caring Black people caring for Black people. They include, of course, folks like Marcus Garvey, who developed something called the Black Cross Nurses. He also created Black grocery stores. There's Black Panther parties, free lunch programs. So it's not just Black people in movement space, but they actually create and make material changes in the lives of the folks that they are helping, and create institutions to do so and take care of some of our most basic needs.
Absolutely. And I think a lot about this concept of race work from the perspective of being here in Baltimore, Maryland, a slave state, but also a northern migration state. So there's an argument that Martin and Martin make that's very powerful to understand, like our critique of the nonprofit industrial complex. And it's basically that we have these spiritually inflected, communalist, African inspired ways of caring for each other. But especially with the northern migration, leaving the South, leaving the incubator of these institutions, that ironically became stronger because they had to be under segregation, but we completely controlled them for the most part. Coming to the North with integration and also the urbanization producing separation from family, church, community, but also just dense city problems, crime, underground economies. There is this deep need for caring for Black and brown people, especially as more of them come up than the industrial base can accommodate. So people are struggling for food, struggling for even basic stuff like hygiene. But there is this progressive, white, Eurocentric social work tradition or progressive tradition that kind of views these folks through the lens of, controlling pathology, cleaning the city up, teaching these folks morality. And Black folks, in the name of social work, had to lose some of their race work foundations and adopt some of the tacit anti-Black conceptions embedded within social work. So I just wanted to read this quote from Martin and Martin to set up the historical analysis Rasheem is going to lead that's going to take up the majority of the episode. But just a quote from Martin and Martin's book, as you mentioned, Rasheem, Spirituality in the Black Helping Tradition, to set up this distinction between social work and race work. They write, quote, "The term social work started out in the late 19th century as social works and was used much in the same way as religion uses the term good works. Long before the term social work was coined, race work had been the social work of the 19th century free Black people. Guilds maintain that race work has links to an unbroken tradition of community work and working for the race that could be traced directly to antebellum communities, both slave and free. Race work was indeed community service. It was community work with a deep spiritual focus. It was based on the idea that Black people had a spiritual calling, mission, or duty to struggle for the freedom and uplift of Black people. Free Black race workers had unconsciously blended the African concept of the destinal self with the Christian concept of predestination. The slaves brought with them the belief that their lives were controlled by fate or destiny, but that an individual within the broad outline of his predestined fate could determine specific courses of action by consulting with diviners or take responsibility for their affairs. Although West African spirituality and Christianity had a concept of destiny, these concepts were different in significant ways. The Christian concept of predestiny entitled the notion of individual sinfulness and desire for individual perfectibility through following the path of Christ. To Europeans, this historically meant a notion of the rise and fall of civilizations. Economically, it meant a linear concept of destiny, moving from poverty to wealth, from rags to riches. Racially, it meant the notion that there was a manifest destiny to rule over the lands of occupied people of color. The West African concept of destiny did not involve inherent willfulness, the rise and fall of nations, individualism, material progress, imperialism, or a linear concept of time. Race destiny among enslaved Africans in America came to mean answering a divine call to get Black people out of the mire of their present circumstance. The race work used the term agency, architect, and instrumentality to indicate that it was this sacred work. Black people were in partnership with God, and that they played an active role in fashioning their destiny as people. So I really think that that linking of social work and the individualistic, progressive, linear notions of control, self-perfection, and bootstraps to American imperialism, manifest destiny. Most people don't see social work that way. They see it as well-meaning people trying to help people out. But to really
Mhm.
propose race work as an African-centered alternative really shows how social work can serve as a tool to justify oppression, and needing your course in this analysis to see race work as a tool of liberatory communal care in response to that.
I 100% agree. I think it's a good time for us to have the book on the screen just in case folks are interested and want to check out the book. I think one of the things that I love about you selecting this particular section, Grand Prix, is because it does highlight some of those things in terms of the distinction. There's like an element of mutual aid. It's not necessarily like I'm up here and you're down here. It's connected to racial uplift, and just to even build on some more of those specific distinctions between race work and what we now call social work. What some of the things that distinguish it is, unlike social work, it has a specific focus on addressing and mitigating several impacts: the impacts of racism, the impacts of challenging oppressive systems, the impacts of it also focuses on addressing historical harm. All of these things are very specific. It's not, when it comes to race work, these things are not an afterthought, which is why we wanted to be intentional in having this conversation and also even having the course. Some of the things, for example, to further highlight those distinctions, let's say racism, for example, social work, like many other disciplines, teaches about its roots with a whitewash historical lens. The review of social work literature reveals a scarcity of attributions from Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Without a more racially diverse perspective on social work history, social workers promote and sustain white supremacy. I should also add that I'm reading a quote from Wright Casey. And I'll tell you the full title of the actual article. The article is "The Whitewashing of Social Work History: How Dismantling Racism in Social Work Education Begins with an equitable history of the profession," is where that quote comes from. I'm going to go ahead and read another quote. And this quote is from Curley and Young, or just actually references some of the work and standpoint and viewpoint that could be found in the work of Corley and Young, or McCon, Alan McMears. And that is, currently social work is still linked to bias, racism, pathology of racialized groups, the erasure of marginalized groups, including race as an afterthought, again, in research, and the differential reception of the scholars and its academic members. I want to go on to talk about how it challenged oppressive systems. And I want to give a specific example of A. Philip Randolph and his approach. But before I go into that, I wanted to open up and see if, Grandpre, if you wanted to add to that while we're getting the picture up to put up A. Philip Randolph's, like, what is that? What is those distinctions? What are some of the things that you see in terms of the distinctions?
Yeah, so I mean, many people in the Black community experience the social worker as an appendage of the criminal legal system. I mean, Dorsey Roberts, in multiple books, including The Killing of the Black Body, talks about how social workers come in and view Black communities through the lens of pathology. They're sent there from mandatory reporters, be they teachers or doctors, that presuppose that Black people aren't able to take care of their families, and they'd be better served with control from the state. So this idea of social workers being here to help Actually, ironically, it leads to a lot of people rejecting the idea that we should invest in state capacity to help anybody. Famously, Ronald Reagan says some of the most frightening words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And
Mm,
frankly, a lot of Black people resonated with that because of their experience with social work as a tool of, again, progressive people saying, it's sad that these poor Black folks are so traumatized, they're so beaten down by racism that they don't know about hygiene. They don't care about their kids because they've been so socialized through slavery to not attach to their children or to physically discipline their children. Like, these are the anti-Black mentalities that come from this sort of liberal vision of almost like trauma informed racism. And it produces a social work infrastructure that can then violently attack the Black family. According to Dorothy Roberts, to conclude, about half of all Black children will be under Child Protective Service investigation at some point in their lives. I know
mm,
we've talked about some of these things in previous episodes, but this comes from a vision of Black families that's inherently deviant, that is baked into a normative white family that social work sees as inevitably the norm. And when that white norm becomes backed by state violence and state power, I mean,
mhm,
it really becomes something dangerous. And I think we have lots of historical examples of social work's limitation not seeing, I need money to take care of my kids. So when A. Philip Randolph talks about integrating the armed services or fighting for labor rights, that's a form of social work. And that social workers will be so separated from that can only happen in a Eurocentric mindset that does
mm,
not value holistic institutions propping up communities' capacity to take care of themselves. That's why we're going
mm.
to do a historical analysis of people that you wouldn't associate with social work per se, but people who do race work as a comprehensive social, economic, cultural, and spiritual vision of uplift.
Oh man, so spot on. I feel like I could go down a tangent on just some of the stuff that you mentioned already in terms of the ways in which the ideology of social work is so connected to pathologizing Black people, Black families, Black communities. They can't do for themselves, so we have to do for them. I know a big contributor to that, of course, as you know, is the Moynihan Report. Also, on previous episodes, we've talked about the carceral nature of social work and their connection with the state. And like you suggested or said before, folks like A. Philip Randolph, I want us to look at race work and look at some of the practice, tactics, and strategies that folks use in terms of racial uplift. Now, I highlight A. Philip Randolph as an example of the power of race work in the labor movement. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background and then I'm going to get into the nitty gritty because I feel like context really matters. Now, in his early life, A. Philip Randolph was born in 1889 in Crescent City, Florida. In 1911, he moved to Harlem, New York after graduating from high school. He initially actually wanted to be an actor, but then quickly started to get engaged in more activism and political work. Some of his overall, to give you an overall view of his race work contribution, it was highly in he was a labor organizer focused on economic advancement. He challenged racial discrimination and employment through organizing labor. He launched a, um, a paper called The Messenger with the financial backing of Lucille Green. And we'll get into that, and some backing from the Socialist Party, but we'll get into that. And also, another big overview of him is that some of his mindset and beliefs in general, like he was against the war, he was pro armed defense, actually, and also had a standpoint of what I kind of put more in the lane of like a democratic socialist. Um, there are some aspects of his socialism or his socialist views that made him quite unpopular with Black elites. Different people do race work. Some folks are more integrationist. Some folks are more separatist. Some folks are more part of the Black radical tradition. And he's more from a school of like that's anti-capitalism. Had a lot of critiques of the labor force and labor institution. Some of his affiliation includes Eugene Debs, which is a socialist political trade unionist, and he kind of introduced him to more socialist ideas and concepts. Now, one of the things that I want to get into in terms of, I want to get specifically into his race work. Before I do that, I want to talk about some of the history that sets the context for why this work is needed. So you have in World War I, Woodrow Wilson wouldn't endorse any anti-lynching provisions. You have A. Philip Randolph, who is against the war. Um, you also have A. Philip Randolph in 1918 is arrested in an anti-war demonstration in Cleveland. He's actually charged with treason. There's a conflict that also grew between white people who wanted to ensure that Black soldiers who returned from the war remained as second class citizens after they returned from the war. So you also have that. And what that ended up being was a Red Summer in 1919. There's about 20 race riots that happened during that time. Now, that is the context for which I want us to get the background of his lived experience and then kind of a historical understanding of where this places him. Now, his strongest work, or a lot of where he did most of his work, is it connects to trade unions. But to understand his work, I want you to have a good understanding of the background. So in the 1920s, trade unions didn't allow Black workers to join. The American Federation of Labor was closed to Black people. You also have this man, George Pullman, who had you know, the Pullman cars are named after George Pullman. He only hires Black people, and he specifically wants to hire previously enslaved Black people. The reason that he wanted to do that is because he wanted folks who were familiar with being subservient, and he wanted to provide a particular experience for his white passengers that emulated the I'm using air quotes now if people are listening on the podcast, that emulated the good old days, right? So these folks weren't very well treated. I mean, on top of the pay was $15 per week. They worked 80 hours per week. They had to wait on their white passengers hand and foot. This was actually still at this time, again, these are former slaves, so this was still considered somewhat of a good job, but they were overworked and grossly underpaid. So there was a lot of complaints and discomfort. In fact, they didn't even have to tell you how oppressed or how bad it was. These folks didn't even have names for themselves. They were just called George because the owner of the railway of the Pullman cars was George Pullman. So they were just all called George. So now you have in August 1925 where A. Philip Randolph arranged a secret meeting with porters. 200 people joined the Brotherhood of Sleeping Cars. Now, before I get into that, I want to talk about that a little bit because that was even a strategy that we should be able to pull from and understand. A. Philip Randolph himself was not a Pullman, did not work in transportation in that way. And the Brotherhood of Sleeping Cars specifically identified and wanted him to be their advocate because he was not a sleeping car porter. And the reason for that is because he could not be threatened with loss of job or threaten any aspect of his livelihood because he was not connected. I want to pause right there because what that reminds me of Grandpre is some of the work actually that even LBS does. Because for folks who say, oh, I can't do XYZ because I have a 501c3 status, or I can't speak out against this because I could lose my job or I could use this. One strategy in race work is, okay, those workers didn't want to do that because it would threaten their livelihood. And that's a real threat, right? So their strategy was to get an advocate. Could you speak a little bit to that and your thoughts on it?
Yeah, just to kind of double down on what you said. So the American Federation of Labor, AFL, is discriminating at this time. So they're producing their own union, pulling their own money together to then pay A. Philip Randolph to operate for their interests. And I think that this idea of, because that's the first question is, how do you make your money? Determines oftentimes the political stances you can take. So being able to have some degree of, and again, this is a sacrifice for people not making a ton of money, but seeing investment in community capacity to advocate collectively as in everyone's best interest. And I think whether it is the churches, the um, insurance and mutual aid societies, the Black civic groups, professional organizations, the ability for race work institutions throughout our history, maroon societies, to be able to pull from resources of Black people as not just an idea of, oh, that's cool to do, but as a essential political maneuvering strategy that gives you more leverage. Because even taking money from white labor would mean that you would be subject to the limitations of the white labor unions, who
That's right.
have conservative people who are union dues payers, or also conservative leadership that it wants to get along with political leadership. So sometimes the idea of, well, we're Black, we're a minority, we don't have a ton of money, presupposes the leverage and the freedom you get from mostly, and again, he's not doing this alone, he's not doing this outside of coalitions and political maneuvering, but depending strongly and or to a substantial degree on resources coming from Black people, is an intentional race work strategy that unites the political mission with the social work mission, because it sees the two as fundamentally intertwined.
Absolutely. I think that piece about coalition building and also where we get money and research, because threat of losing employment is a real threat when you talk about speaking out, and also where do you get your money from? So some of where he got his money from. A. Philip Randolph received $10,000 in support from socialist groups, and that allowed him to travel the country to set up different chapters. Now, Chicago stands out because Chicago at that time had the most porters than anywhere in the US. Randolph and Webster held meetings every 2 weeks for, I think it was like 2 years or so. George Pullman asked, I mean, he had so much strength and so much power and built so much momentum that George Pullman, who owns a whole, porter car business, reached out to the Chicago Defender and asked them, could you write an op-ed against A. Philip Randolph's union? I feel like that's another point of strategy. One of the things that George Pullman saw is he's getting traction. He's getting popular. More people are interested in what he has to say. And what is a counter weapon? I need to change the image of who this guy is, and I need to have Chicago Defender write an op-ed. There's so much power in just simple things like writing an op-ed when it's connected to a much bigger strategy. And I feel like George Pullman realized that. So by 1926, there were the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car locals in every city, including Chicago. So that is like day after day, time after time, a lot of work. And what are some of the things that made that happen? One, he had the support of some folks in some socialist movement groups so that he can tour. The Pullman, the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Cars reached out to him and say, hey, we can't do this on the front line because we risk this. Could you do this? Those are just two strategies that I want to highlight. I also want to go back to that other point that I made earlier about George Pullman asking the Chicago Defender to write an op-ed against A. Philip Randolph. And what was A. Phillips Randolph counter? He created the Messenger. In the Messenger, he had several critiques. He had criticisms of the Black elite. And one of the things that also helped to keep that business going is I want to highlight Lucille Green, which ended up being his wife. Lucille Green was a Black socialite. She's also a businesswoman. She owned a hair salon. She's very popular. And they get married, and he needs to, he's still doing his thing. A lot of the funds from her business help to keep the Messenger afloat, right? So you talk about partnerships, you talk about families, we talk about community, and where some of that strength lies. Do you want to comment on any of that, Grandpre, before I move on?
Yeah, just the idea that in the community having people in alignment. And again, like, this is a socialist that's getting money from a capitalist institution. Like, the fluidity of, like, oh, we're pure socialists, we can never engage capitalism, is kind of
Mhm.
so anachronistic and out of the context of the reality of cooperative institutions where people are seeking alignment, even though, people, the way I say it, we black people didn't choose capitalism, capitalism landed on us, kind of like Malcolm X and Plymouth Rock, right? So just oftentimes people presuppose ideological assumptions behind the actions people take to survive in the midst of white supremacy and capitalism. But again, you see her business helping his organizing in a way that, again, people know it. It's like, we know what happens. We know a lot of people that call themselves socialists have trust funds, or they just work jobs, but actually sort of being intentional and sort of like building a political strategy that presupposes a synergy between those two, and around the concept of we in the community share this aligned vision, even if the way that we come to it may be different.
I love that. I mean, I think to the point that you're making, coalition, I like coalition building even within different strategies. So even if you're an integrationist and I'm part of the Black radical tradition, and you're a capitalist and I'm a socialist, if we're working towards the same thing, and there are strengths and even in some cases not so strengths for what we're trying to do and move forward. So I just want to highlight that as a general practice and tactic, and also just highlight her in her support of him. Now that didn't come easy because the messenger grew to be more successful. And as A. Philip Randolph started to have a little bit more of his critiques of the Black elite, it actually ran people away from Lucille's business because her salon was keeping it afloat. When she lost business, the messenger also had to end up being folded. Now, I want to take us also to move forward a little bit more to the era of the Great Depression. Folks are generally familiar with the Great Depression. I want to talk about it in the context of A. Philip Randolph and this particular movement space, to just further highlight the type of person that he is. So the Great Depression. So half of Black people lost their job during the Great Depression. Memberships in the trade unions dwindled down to about just 700 nationwide. What then happened? The wives of the union members, they were called the Ladies Auxiliary, they raised funds in an effort to keep the union alive. In 1934, hundreds of labor strikes erupted across the US. The National Guard actually ended up being deployed to about 16 states. Another thing that happened during that time is FDR ended up signing pro-labor legislation. Now, this is where people were able to choose between a company union and they could choose the Brotherhood of Sleeping Cars. 3 out of 4 workers still chose the Brotherhood. Now, with A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Cars seeming to win and pull up tractions, and I want to say all of these losses and hits because it didn't come easy. You heard me say his wife lost her business because he was speaking up. You heard me say half of the people during the Great Depression lost their job. You also heard me mention the wives of the sleeping car porters raising money to try to keep the organization afloat. And it was not for nothing because legislation ended up moving in the direction that favored the sleeping car porters. Now, one of the things that happened, his nemesis, if you will, George Pullman, sent A. Philip Randolph a blank check with a note that said that he can enter any amount of money so long as it did not exceed $1 million. The record shows that A. Philip Randolph took a picture of the check, took it and put it in a frame and put it on the wall, but sent back the original check with a note that says Black people's progress is not for sale. This is a person who did this after his wife lost her business. Half of the sleeping car folks lost their job, and but what that check signals is that they are making traction, right? And they are making certain advancements. And what Pullman is doing is he's using a strategy of a way of divide and conquer. Like, let me buy you off so that you can stop doing what you're doing. and
Hmm.
so that could continue to you know, to dominate this area in this industry. There's so much more, and we could do a whole episode on A. Philip Randolph, but I'll start there. But there are some other strategies and things that he did in terms of the war and the war effort, which he was not for. But what he wanted to do is he saw it as an opportunity to integrate the military. He was the chief architect of the March on Washington. I'm going to pause there and let Grandpre. I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was just going to sort of wrap up with A. Philip Randolph because what he's
Yeah.
known for is the threat for the March on Washington in the 40s, which
Mm-hmm.
gets Truman to do the executive order to integrate the military. Again, that is in coalition with a lot of other labor groups. But one thing that happens is that, as we've covered in previous podcasts, the integration of the military and ingratiation into the military forces a massive increase in Black literacy. And
Mm-hmm.
also Black people have experience in the Korean War, basically working with and or giving orders to white people, and they come home and they're far more militant in a lot of ways. So you have the Southern uprisings of the 50s in part because of the work of A. Philip Randolph. And I think that what I'm trying to get across is that this is a race work tradition because the work those Black folks did when they came home to benefit from those opportunities, we needed moments of leverage, interest convergence. But when we got back from the benefits of the interest convergence, it was reinvested often into containers Black people owned and controlled. So whether it was Black auxiliary unions in Detroit in the 60s, the radical Black unions that pushed demands for reparations and to rebuild the Black community after the 68 riots, whether it was the infrastructure for the civil rights movement, the defense of Black women who were sexually assaulted in the South and literally armed largely Black male patrols in the South protecting protesters. Like these were the race work containers that were built off of A. Philip Randolph's work that then produced a virtuous cycle where people can take the benefits of interracial organizing and limited concessions around integration and invest it back into benefits from the community. And I think sometimes the assumption is the only thing that has historically ever worked for us is when we joined the labor movement and the white labor movement and we have like class solidarity. And not that those things are bad, but an example that I like to mention is that in the 70s, they basically integrated port workers in Baltimore. They had segregated unions. And basically, the Black workers basically called for the resegregation of the unions. They wanted their segregated union back because, somewhat similar to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, when you have a Black union, first of all, Black people have seniority in that union. So that means they're getting more hours, they're getting more money, they're getting more opportunities to work, but also they're just getting more control. They're getting more freedom to operate in what I would say is a race work manner. So it's important how we narrate the victories of A. Philip Randolph. It isn't just he was part of the labor movement. He was part of a Black race work tradition that intersected with the labor movement. And that's important because it puts into context a notion that the only times we can ever get anything is when we depend on institutions and coalitions outside of our community versus using the cultural, spiritual assets and economic assets of our community to do that work.
Mm. Well said. Another aspect of race work is addressing historical harm. So, as it relates, for example, to social work history, oftentimes students are told and retold the same whitewash narrative about the discipline, its inception, the dynamics of social work that are important to remember. Um, Now, it's important to remember that it's largely typically populated by white individuals, often assisting and serving people of color. And I don't think it's necessarily accidental that that the history is written this way. One of the things that young social workers are talked about is, and she's considered a pioneer in social work, is Jane Addams. Now, in 1899, Jane Addams began, she was actually writing against, Jane Addams, a white woman, she was actually writing against lynching, which she rejected as, she called it a hideous act. She blamed white people's racism for causing harm, to use violent means to punish Black people in the South. But at the same time, she describes the victim of lynching as bestial and uncontrolled, and erroneously assumed that by and large they had actually committed the crimes for which they had been accused. Now, it wasn't until we have renowned African American journalist and civil rights activist Ida B. Wells, who publicly took her to task and helped, educated her on actually some of the facts of lynching and conveying how lynching was part of a system of intimidation intended to strip African Americans of their civil rights and humanity. I want to stop there because I feel like we have Jane Addams now, and we need more Ida B. Wells calling them out. Now, and what I mean by we have Jane Addams is we have well intentioned, maybe progressive white women who go into communities and they're there to help, but they are, while they're doing it, they are pathologizing and perpetuating and continuing some of the same things that cause some of the harm and some of this imaging. So in dialogue with Ida B. Wells, Jane deepened her understanding of the significance of racism in America. This resulted in her further engagement and support of African American civil rights, actually. So, for one, an example of that is keeping the Chicago schools from being segregated, becoming a founding member of the NAACP. Toward the end of her life, Jane Addams stated in her book, The Second 20 Years at the Hull House, that racism against African Americans was threatening democracy itself and was the gravest situation in our American life. Now, another aspect specifically to this concept of race work is done by Black people for Black people. That's not how social work is set up. In fact, the majority of a lot of the social workers are white women, and they are going into communities of color. According to the Council of Social Work Education 2019 annual report, 61.1% of the full-time faculty and 58.3 of the part-time faculty identified as white, right? The 2019 CSW annual report also demonstrates that the predominant group of social work students at all levels identify as white, while 48.7% of the bachelorette identify as white, 50.2% of the master's levels, 36 of practice doctorates. All of these folks are going in largely into communities of color. And I think it's just important to highlight and note that. Also want to, I'm glad that we're having this conversation, Grandpre, and looking at some folks who are not conventionally considered social workers, which I'm fine with because they are race workers. They are a little bit something more, right?
Yeah, and just kind of having conversations with young folks that go through these social work programs, they have exposure to some of these texts, but it's oftentimes they're just ancillary. They're just kind of there. And the core foundation of it is the Eurocentric text. And that leads to young people who don't have the tools necessary to solve problems in our community in the way that actually reflects the tools of race work. And the example that I had was sort of addiction and a correlative community problems from the drug trade. So, I mean, when you go to social work, you learn about 12-step, you learn about harm reduction, you learn about traditional psychological notions of disease model of addiction, and you end up depending on a medical apparatus that oftentimes is, either giving people methadone and Suboxone and saying you have a permanent brain illness, which is not the historical tradition. Even if you support methadone, many times people say, well, taper me off, like help me get clean, help me get a job. And again, just the correlative community investments, jobs, infrastructure, the trauma that drives addiction isn't talked about. So one of the examples I talk about is, into something people of a certain age may resonate with. The crack era was seen as this all-consuming destruction of the Black community. But once we get through the mid-90s, crime and murder has basically declined almost nonstop since then. And that would seem impossible if you were around at all in the 80s and 90s. And so what happened? Was it mass incarceration? No. It was the Black community choosing, in many ways, in a race work tradition, to change institutional patterns, to reactivate, whether it's the Million Man March, mosques, church, community outreach, demanding more political concessions from the Democratic Party around certain forms of job creation and benefiting from economic growth, but also community norms around crack cocaine use. It's like there's this noted shift in Donovan X. Ramsey's book Crack is King, like shifting culturally from even hip hop talking about crack to talking about cannabis and selling
Mm,
and using cannabis because it's seen as less violent both in the streets and less violent to your body and mind, basically from the perspective of crack is flooding our communities because the government wants to use it as a counter-revolutionary tool to destroy our communities. Like this was a dominant cultural conception of crack as a tool of genocide that was so widely accepted, it fundamentally changed America. Like federal government documents basically concede that it was the black community's response to the crack era that ended the crack era, not anything the government did. And I
mm,
think similarly, examples like Mutulu Shakur, Tupac Shakur's stepfather, and the work he did with Lincoln Detox, basically taking over Lincoln Hospital and using acupuncture and a radical politicization as a tool of addiction care and re-energizing and activating Vietnam veterans to kick the opioid habits they got to deal with the violence of the war, basically set a template for addiction treatment that we're still trying to catch up to today. And I think
mm,
someone like Mutulu, as a race worker, and the sort of legacies of conscientization from his stepson Tupac, I think showed this more expansive and more powerful race work tradition, harnessing spiritual conceptions, but towards very concrete material community interventions that, in really ways, I think show a direct competition potentially with the mainstream public health and social work traditions. And oftentimes, just objectively, our methodologies come out on top. It's just we don't have the money and we don't have the political power to invest in and protect those interventions. Batula goes to jail for 40 years because of, him basically trying to expropriate funds from a Brinks truck, Brinks robbery that goes bad, trying to continue his political missions. And of course, the trauma and violence of seeing your loved ones assassinated by the state drives people to addiction. And just sort of what are the tools necessary to counteract that? It's just not something that a traditional social work curriculum has really had the space to accommodate.
mm. Yeah, I love that as an example. I want to talk more about too the power of political race work and also some of the erasure of it by talking about a man that I don't know a lot of people know about. His name is Lewis Adams. And one of the things that I feel like is really important to um, I'm just gonna go through and just like talk about some of the significant contributions that Lewis Adams made and how folks are still benefiting from them today and what that erasure does, right? So Lewis Adams is a former enslaved Black American who, without formal training, he was literate. He could read, he could write. He also could speak several languages. He was recognized as a leader in his community. Let me provide context. His community was Macon County, that is situated in Alabama, right? Um, Now, one of the things about him, he was concerned that without education, Black people would not be able to support themselves. So he first started out he tried to establish a normal school for Black people in 1874. He actually did this with a former enslaver. He partnered with a former enslaver to actually create a normal school. Now, this was you know, um, very, very, I guess you could say like largely informal, small, but it was a school that help Black people be able to gain literacy, be able to read, be able to write, to be able to make a living for themselves. And again, like I said, he was established as like a leader in the community at that time. I also want to put into context now in 1880, the Black people of Macon County possessed political power. Black people were actually a great majority at that particular time. Now, this is before 1901, when before 1901, when Alabama decided to rewrite its constitution so that Black people could not vote. But in 1880, the Black people held a majority, and they also had the political majority. Now, at that particular time, former Confederate Colonel W.F. Foster, he was running for Alabama legislator on the Democratic ticket. He approached uh, Lewis Adams, who was at that time a Republican, And he asked them, what would it take for me to get you to encourage basically like all the black people to vote for me? Like politicians do this now. They go to whoever's the leader. That's usually a minister of some sort. I mean, or traditionally in the past has been a minister of some sort. So what can we do? How can we make a deal here that you could get all of the black people to vote for me? Now he could have asked for anything. He could have asked for money. He could have asked for, I don't know, something substantial, particularly for himself. But what he told him is, I really want to establish a school for black people to be able to be um, educated so that they can make a living for themselves. Now, what Foster did, Foster said, okay, if you get all of the black people to vote for me, then what I will do is I will make sure that we get you that school. Adams was true to his word. He talked to all of the black people under his influence, and he encouraged them to vote for Foster. Foster remained true to his word because Adams delivered. So what happened was, not only did he help him to establish a school, there was $2,000 per year at that particular time put aside for teachers to be able to come to Macon County and teach at that school. Now, Adams wrote at that time because people weren't necessarily very literate in that area, so he had to outsource, I guess you could say, for where those teachers would come from. So Adams wrote to Hampton, Virginia, and asked for someone to come and set up the school, like to help set up. We already have the resources, we already have the land, help us set up the school. Now, the black people of Tuskegee at that particular time, well, before I get that, he asked for someone to help come up the school. Um, and the head of Hampton suggested Booker T. Washington. He said, I will give you, he actually asked him if he knew of a white guy to come and head up the school. And he said, I actually don't know of any good white man that could do that, but I have a teacher here, and he is a fine gentleman, and he would be able to head up this particular institution. I want to go ahead and put up a picture of Booker T. Washington, because Booker T. Washington then comes to help to set up the school. He's also known in a lot of ways as the founder of the school. But I want to talk about the fact. I want to talk about the history of how Tuskegee was established. The black people of Tuskegee used the ballot to accomplish their goals. They used political power. What Lewis Adams did is he leveraged political power to do that. This man came to him and said, "Hey, how can you get the black people all together to vote for me?" And he said, "This is the exchange." Now, here's what I do know before I even get into, and let me say the black people of Tuskegee used the ballot to get their goals. The founding date was July 4th, 1881, and that was authorized by House Bill 165. Okay. Now, there's a couple of reasons that makes this event significant to me. One, because one of the things that I know with politics, and I'm not super ingrained in politics, is there are trade-offs. There are negotiations that are made, right? But what are the compromises that we make? What are the trade-offs that we make? What Adams could have did, and even what A. Philip Randolph could have done, is they could have took the money and put it in their pocket and bolstered their own lived experience and career. But they both used race work to move something forward. This person who was a formerly enslaved, didn't necessarily even want to head the school, didn't ask for money to just put in his own pocket. He asked for money to establish a school. He was able to get that school through using the ballot. Now, the fact that Lewis Adams had adopted the philosophy of staying out of, if Lewis Adams had adopted the philosophy of staying out of politics, Tuskegee would not exist. Why is this particularly important? It's particularly important to me because of the philosophy and some of the teachings of the illustrious Booker T. Washington, who encouraged Black folks not to engage with politics. He was very much for promoting definitely quite a bit of like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but also vocational development, prove your worthiness, prove, um, just develop yourself, but don't engage in politics. Don't try to vote. And that's also going to come up later as we talk. But the very institution that he is credited with building and expanding would not exist without that political race work. I'm gonna pause there and let Grandpre chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know any of that, and I think that that's very much demonstrative of Du Bois's reassessment of Booker T later in life. People sometimes make Du Bois and Booker T out like it was Garvey and Du Bois. They had
Mm-hmm.
disagreements, but it was far more cordial and it was far more a sequencing question. Because I think Booker T's best version of his argument is similar to what you said about A. Philip Randolph, is that we need a mechanism to fund our political engagement and industrial power to be able to stand on our own politically. Because the opportunity presented was one of just mutual interest between this Dixiecrat who probably supports the Klan and a bunch of other crazy stuff, and just a particular moment. And how do we force those moments more consistently if we don't have the ability to fund our own political interventions? And Du Bois basically comes around on that point, but basically says that the spaces Booker T chose to fund that political work, vocational education, ended up being building a house on wet sand, because technology and industrial changes made it so that building up an industrial base for Black people was too easily destroyed by the Great Depression and automation. Right. But the ability to actually think through that political complexity would not be a thing if you just assumed that Booker T was a sellout and a coon, or if you assume that Adams was a sellout and a coon for working with the Dixiecrat. Or if you assume that, Du Bois was a problematic because, he turned away from internationalist communism and socialism to get on his Pan-African thing when he was with Nkrumah. The point is that there is this historical tradition of institution building, and if we go through it with the lens of this is intentional political work that's part of a larger care tradition that we're calling race work, we can evaluate those things objectively through the lens of criteria we set up for ourselves, not criteria imposed on us by Eurocentric political dogma, be it Marxism or American political pragmatism or any other system of evaluating what our people did facing choices and conditions most of us can't imagine. Many of us are taught to attack and diminish the limit and focus on the limitations of our political figures as opposed to objectively evaluating the conditions they face, seeing their choices through this lens of trying to adhere to this spiritual communal care tradition and figuring out what we can learn to better apply those lessons in our current environment.
I mean, I think that that's so spot on. I mean, and the thing, like some of what you said to emphasize is not only look at certain leaders through their specific limitations, but how were some of them able to identify this is this is as far as I could go with this. You of this mindset, of this background, of these resources, you can pick up here. Like even if I go back to Lewis Adams, I told you with the original school, he partnered with the former enslaver to start the school. It's like, if you can help me advance this greater thing, right? And then, like you said, Foster might have been a Dixiecrat, might have been with the Klan, but there was an exchange there that is actually moved towards a liberatory like it's like it helps.
Well, even defining the practice as liberatory is important, because I think a lot of even viewers of this channel have been conditioned to see historically Black colleges as the opposite of liberatory in many ways, that they are engines to produce a Black elite that then gets weaponized against the masses. Where if you actually, again, put it in a historical context of lynchings and even just industrial education, like Tuskegee was not producing people going to all white parties at the time. They were producing people who were keeping your donkey alive. And if your donkey died, you couldn't feed your family. Like still today, Tuskegee produces like the most Black veterinarians of any school, like a massive percentage of Black veterinarians. So just even seeing this appropriately and not anachronistically in the context of meeting essential community needs in an environment where a comprehensive attack on the humanity of Black people denuded us from basic meeting any community needs. The idea of having a school in that context is an essential part of a larger political trajectory of liberation. Part of it is, again, in our current environment, we've been so jaded and so conditioned to attack um, the choices that our political elders have made that we can't even see the basic value in them. And I think
Mm,
race work is a lens that helps us reevaluate that.
mm, love that. Love that framing. So I want to go deeper into it still and talk a little bit. I'm still want to talk about that time period. And one of the groups I want to talk about is the TCA, or the Tuskegee Civic Association. And before I get into talking about them, I'm a context person. I want to know the background. What is the time? What is the place? What makes this relevant and significant? So the place, I want to start first with talking a bit about the fact that in 1890, Mississippi was the first state in the old Confederacy to rewrite its laws to exclude Black people from voting. This was virtually adopted by every other state. In 1901, Alabama adopted it as well. Alabama, what happened is let me actually, before I go into them rewriting their constitution, um, to emphasize and even highlight, if I can, the the strength, the power, the sway, some might also even say the hubris of Booker T. Washington at that particular time. He actually wrote the state at that time and said, and asked them, like, I don't think it's a good idea for you to rewrite your constitution so that Black people cannot vote. Maybe instead just rewrite it so that only people who are uneducated or illiterate can't vote, but don't make it so that all black people can't vote. um so that's just an interesting little footnote during that time period, that he had the ability to make moves like that. He had the ability to, as a at that time they called them principals, as a principal of a school, as the principal of Tuskegee. He had the ability to actually talk to um elected officials, high ranking, about big policy moves. Anywho, so Alabama rewrote its constitution anyway, and purged all voters. So they started from scratch. They purged all voters from the rolls and adopted new rules for re-registration. Now, this included, of course, literacy tests, but it also included things like vouchers. And the vouchers were a Black person needed two white people to vouch for them, was an example of some of the things that were instituted. In the 1930s, there was a group of people. They first started out as they were actually three Black men that were pretty comfortably middle class, and they were part of something called the Tuskegee Men's Club. Now, later that became the Tuskegee Civic Association. They began to organize and they got Black people registered. Like in 1940, again, this is the Dole's White Clean, and they having to start over. So in 1940, there was about only 29 Black people registered in a county that is majority Black, by the way. In 1946, they were able to help to make sure that 115 Black people were registered. In 1950, they got 514. In 1954, that rose to 855. So now in 1956, it became clear to the white folks that Black people in Macon would soon have a majority of the registered voters. And for years also, TCA were trying to assuage the folks of Macon County that even if they had a majority, they weren't going to threaten the status quo. They weren't going to try to disrupt things or anything like that. But the white folks were not, they didn't feel reassured. So what they did is, the white folks of that community, they pressured the legislation to pass laws to gerrymander the city of Tuskegee. And on July 13th, 1957, the city boundaries were changed to exclude 420 Black people, leaving only 10 Black people within the city lines, and no white folks were impacted at all in the gerrymandering. I think it went from a city that was 4 sides to one that had 28 sides. I wish I had a picture right now that I could show you how ridiculous the the lines were. So TCA called for a selective boycott, and that lasted for about 4 years. And this had a high level of effectiveness because 26 businesses within just the first 2 years, 26 white businesses had to close down. The black people of now, one of the ways that they were able to do this boycott, here's another economic thing in terms of strategy, is they had a degree of economic independence from the local whites, and they used it. Now, what I mean specifically about by that is a lot of these folks either worked directly at the school or they worked at the hospital that were established, and that was largely funded by like state. So the local businesses or the grocery stores, them boycotting those, it wasn't a person where they can go to them and say, make sure that this person loses their job. This is a similar tactic and strategy that you see in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Cars, right? So we can engage in politics and in some of these strategies if we're just, strategic. Okay. So now what this also tells me about that particular time, they had economic independence from local whites and they used it, but their political power at that particular time still didn't increase. That also illustrates to me that the white folks were willing to suffer economic ruin rather than concede political power. I hope that that tells us something about buying the block versus political power. I'm gonna keep going. So black people in Tuskegee, they not only achieved a degree of educational and economic freedom, um, they achieved these, but white people still controlled the taxes. They still controlled the school system. They determine law enforcement practices, right? So they're wealthier, they're more educated. But what does this tell us about the economy of politics? I'm gonna pause there, Grandpre. You want to jump in?
Yeah. Um, I think it's part of what Du Bois and Booker T were trying to figure out, and it's almost an example of the limitations of the Booker T approach. And I think the other thing that it doesn't account for, in addition to the inability of black people to hold on to this foothold of industrial leverage, no one saw international finance coming. So these boycotts would not be nearly as effective now because of the nature of finance capital and how money flows, but also even trying to leverage the material interests of white people. Many of them have an investment in the stability of the political economic order, to the point where, again, these are middle class shop owners. The people with the real big power would let them go under. And it's not just that white people would be willing to suffer, it's that the rich white people would allow the white people who think they're rich to suffer in
Right.
order to keep the larger system of control. That, because if you have real political power, then the actual rich white people are in danger. You're looking at land reappropriations, you're looking at taxation policy, and ways that could actually put the actual real powerful white people in danger. And they'll sell out the
Mm,
black, the white small business person in the name
mhm,
of preserving the political order that keeps their profits flowing. So even just understanding like the gradations of this term is thrown around a lot, but just actual intersectionality or multidimensionality of class and race in terms of what it means for political alliances and political leverage or lack thereof, I think is
mhm,
something that these historical examples give us more insight into. And again, just like we can see these things a little bit now with hindsight, but in the moment when you're seeing these things happen, it takes the experiences of black people organizing and mobilizing in order to get these lessons. And I think one of the points of race work is for us to actually take these folks as political strategists seriously and
mm,
evaluate the logic they brought to their campaigns, the limitations of those campaigns, but with also within the context of the success of those campaigns. Like shutting down 26 businesses is a degree of political pressure. It just maybe didn't account for the scale of the interest that people had in investment in the status quo.
mm. No, I mean, I think that speaks to that whole thing too. When people talk about politically, people voting against their own self interest, it's like, no, I don't think we know their self interest. We assume that their business is more important to them, but actually, what's more important is their political power, and they have a reason for that being because they can control. Like, if I control the politics, I could get the money. You know what I mean? If I'm controlling the law enforcement, I can control who lives and who dies, who goes to jail and who doesn't. If I control the school system, I control how the children are educated instead of just focusing on the money. You know what I'm saying? So I think that is a very important lesson to learn. So TCA, they do all of this work, and it's important to also highlight that in 1961, the at the same time that the boundaries of the um the city were restored as a result of legal action that determined that the gerrymandering was in violation of the 15th Amendment, right? I feel like a lot of times when we're studying history, we get these data points, but we don't get the like, how did they do this? Now, during the same, I'm gonna tell you how. During the same period as the gerrymandering issue, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights did an investigation on Macon County. Now, what helped with their investigation is the strategies and techniques and everything that TCA did. TCA officials testified that for a 27-year time period from 1951 to 1958, 1,585 applications for voter registration were submitted, and only 510 voter certificates were actually issued. They had record of every Black person who applied for voter certification since 1951. They had a representative station at the courthouse every day to make sure that they took account of that. And in 1959, Macon County became the first county against which the Department of Justice actually filed a suit about voting rights. Soon the number of Black people exceeded the number of white voters by a substantial margin. In 1964, there were approximately a total of 7,212 voters in the county. 3,733 were Black, 3,479 were white. That's about half and half. 2 years later, by 1966, this had increased to 6,803 Black people and 4,495 white folks that were registered to vote. This is the impact of some of the work that they were doing. Now, all of this meaningful work, this is the frustrating part for me. All of this meaningful work that they did, but they didn't want and they didn't promote Black people to necessarily run for office. They are still I want to say under the influence, if you will, of this ideology that Booker T. Washington had established for that time in terms of engaging with and how we engage with politics. So they had their reasons, and I'm going to tell you their reasons that not only did they did not put forth a Black candidate, and for other folks who like the Nonpartisan Voters League that was established in 1956, they put forth Black candidates. They tried to get all of the Black people to vote for their candidate, but they had a counter. TCA, these are both Black orgs. TCA went around and actually encouraged all of the Black people to not vote for the Black candidate. And of course, they were the folks who got folks registered in the first place, right? So people are probably more inclined to listen to them along these lines. Now, let me tell you their reasons. Their reasons that they said for not um, encouraging Black folks to vote for Black folks or for them presenting a particular candidate is one, they wanted to show the whites that they have nothing to fear from any sort of Black power, right? Two, they were like, we need to gain experience first. We've never held office. We can't just go in there and just like take over stuff. And three, if Black people only elect Black people, then the white people might leave and they're going to sabotage everything on their way out. So you have all of these practices of this group that I would definitely lean more to being integrationists, because they were working to be included. They were working on, the civic engagement, and they had meaningful contributions that they made um, to Black folks' civic involvement. I don't want to say engagement, but involvement, because folks got signed up. I think it's a difference between showing up and actually being engaged. And they just stopped just shy of actual power, in my personal opinion, because they did not want to, well, because of those reasons that I shared. You want to chime in, Grand Prix?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful to look at a potential, and it's not entirely, but juxtaposition between Alabama and Mississippi. So in
Ah.
Alabama, you have this particular approach. In Mississippi, you have the Mississippi Freedom Democrats. You have other parts of these states, Lowndes County, sort of the Black Panther Party, and sort of autonomous organizing around pushing back against these white primaries, the Dixiecrats freezing folks out, Fannie Hamer leaving the political convention in New Jersey because they refused to seat the representatives of Mississippi Freedom Democrats, and that leading to the pressure that leads to the Voting Rights Act passing. And I think it is an important shift in like recognizing the power of the vote, not in the name of inclusion into the existing system, but to mobilize the power of controlling state resources to invest in Black communities and invest in the capacity of supporting Black institution building, which was more of the impetus behind the Voting Rights Act this compared to the Civil Rights Act, right? So I
Mm.
think that even just looking at Fannie Hamer going from Freedom Democrats in the Democratic National Convention, President Lyndon B. Johnson literally has an emergency broadcast in order to counter program Fannie Hamer's testimony to the Democratic National
Mm.
Convention to make sure she doesn't get the media attention. So she ends up doing the piggy bank. And of course, the piggy bank is like a hog exchange where, you loan out hogs to people and they raise them and they can feed their families with them and then give one of the children, the sows have back to the piggy bank, and just sort of focusing on institution building and meeting people's needs directly. And that's narrated as if she's like so broken and jaded by the Democrats not embracing them. And it's just like caring so much what other people think in the name of viewing incorporation into American democracy as a definition of success. And I would just say in conclusion, this is a different version of American democracy than we see now. This is
Mm.
a American democracy that had yielded, even in the 60s, incredible progress in many people's minds for Black people in terms of incorporation into the industrial economy. So post World War II, some people genuinely felt that, I mean, America is a rising international hegemon. And it's
Mm.
understandable to want to ride that wave towards the security of you and your family. But I think that the race work tradition gives us the space to have compassion for that choice, but also say, in this expansive vision of especially Pan-African solidarity, you know, the factory jobs that Black people are living off of are building bombs that are going to fight in the
Mm.
Cold War and Vietnam and all these other places. And is there a vision of Black progress that cannot require investment, integration into not just a burning house, but a genocidal juggernaut?
Mm.
And I think that these are the questions that Black nationalists have been raising. But I think that the race work perspective gives us a vision of seeing it not only as a moral question, but as how do we build strategies for communal care and uplift if the factory job in the munitions plant is a solid, potentially unionized way to feed your family. How do we
Mm.
offer alternatives, or how do we help organize those people into visions of justice that see beyond where they are as a possibility of the totality of what liberation can look like?
Mm. Oh, that's that. I love it. I feel like this and conversations like this are particularly important, um, because of all of the things that you just said, because it's not everything is not super like straightforward. There are a multitude of strategies, there are multitude of methods, and we need to have better understand those strategies and tactics, the ideology, the time and space that they were in, to better understand the decisions that were made. What lessons can we take from the decisions that they made, and to do so in a way that is less about judging and more about um just gaining, just in general, gaining deeper understanding of how history is in fact um, a resource, and not just something that we can use to reference. And with that, I know that for some of you, this probably was maybe like more than enough, and some people want to have more and take a deeper dive. I want to let you know that we will be having an opportunity for that, not just in additional podcasts that will follow this, but there is actually a race work course that is coming up, and it is part of Timbuktu. Timbuktu is a yearly course that is offered by Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and we actually have a multitude of courses that you could take. There's Afrocentric approaches to advocacy. There's the course that I'll be teaching, which is race work, and then there's another course that takes place after mine. This course is an online course. It's 100% online. It's every Tuesday from 6 to 8. It starts August 26th. I'm going to strongly encourage everybody to register now. I know what's on the screen, and there's nothing that you could directly click on. And also, for people who are listening, if you want to register, you can go to a couple of places. One place that is the easiest to go to is lbsbaltimore.com/events. If you also go on Eventbrite and type in either Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, or you could probably type in Timbuktu, or you could possibly type in race work. You'll see my face, you'll see information and background on the course. Again, this was just a snippet of some of what we would go over in the course. We take a deeper dive, and it's about a 5 week, or is it 6 weeks? 5 or 6 weeks in length. Again, it's online. What we've talked about today, I'm going to just kind of summarize some of the conversations that we had today, and then I'm going to kick it over to Grandpre to kind of like close us out. So just to recap, this discussion has been one that has really emphasized that race work emerged from Black communal responses to racialized suffering, and it centers in a lot of cases, spirituality, personal responsibility, collective liberation. Some of the examples that were brought up was Grandpre brought up maroon societies. We talked about, we mentioned Marcus Garvey and the Black Cross nurses and Black Panther parties, and how some of these community programs and the culturally rooted resistance to the crack epidemic came up, demonstrating how Black communities develop internal systems of care when external systems failed them. This podcast also went on to critique the professionalization of social work, noting its roots in white supremacy, individualism, Eurocentric ideals of helping, in contrast, I will say, to race work, which is deeply spiritual, communal, rooted in African concept of destiny and collective responsibility. Unlike conventional social work, it does not treat race as an afterthought, but it is central to the analysis of action and how we move forward. We use a few key historical examples of A. Philip Randolph, labor organizing. We talked about Lewis Adams' political maneuvering and how that actually was the foundation of the Tuskegee Institute. And ultimately, the podcast, I really hope what folks get from it is it calls for the restoration, I know words, the restoration and practice of African-centered human service traditions today, right? And I hope that folks enjoyed listening, because I enjoyed talking about it, and I super enjoyed talking to Grandpre.
Yeah, I mean, even someone working with you and understanding some of the source material, a lot of this stuff I just had no idea. And I think framing it through the lens of race work is important because it's so often just sort of pigeonholed into local stories and abstract political histories, and having it presented to the community within a larger system of care, I think puts a lot of this historical and political work in the context of what I think many people who consider themselves African-centered, Black-centered, Pan-Africanists want to know is how do you apply these theories and how do you
Mm,
actually use history as a resource to improve conditions today. And I think that that's part of the value of the course that you're going to bring as someone who is a professor of social work, but also an artist, but also sort of working with institutions that are materially touching young people and touching institutions of nonprofits. This is a good example of using history as a resource, sort of Sankofa that go back and fetch it vision and practice. So I think that for folks that know LBS know that we have this sort of institutional Pan-African commitment. And what does that actually look like in practice? I think this is a good example of that. And we're able to have that as a foundational vision of the organization because of the support of folks in the community kind of doing what the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and other entities have done, is using the resources of the Black community to be able to build a foundation of support for an institution that can then operate on the community's behalf. So if you're interested in what you're seeing and listening to, please sign up for Rasheem's course. But if you can't do that, please consider becoming a sustainer. For a little $10 a month, you can help us support the political work that we do, building upon these theories, actually applying them to real world policy here in Baltimore and Maryland. And if you're interested, please go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain. And we thank you for listening to this episode of In Search of Black Power. You can find this episode and more on our home for these podcasts, which is the Black Liberation Media Collective. So you can check out blkliberationmedia.org or just type Black Liberation Media into YouTube and find all the other great podcasts of other folks on the Cooperative Media Network. And we thank you. And again, we'll see you next time on In Search of Black Power.
Black power.